Hey, so I'm Ranger Kyle with Vicksburg National Military Park. So we're out here at the Wisconsin Monument. So what's unique about the Wisconsin Monument is one of the few monuments we have in the park that has the names of every single soldier that served in the Vicksburg campaign from the state of Wisconsin. It's paid for by the state of Wisconsin, and one of the other unique things about it is it honors actually other parts of the campaign. We're most famous for the siege itself, but as you can see up there, one of the infantrymen is wearing the winter overcoat. So the idea that with that is that we're honoring the fact that these soldiers are out here in winter conditions, not just the summer siege. This was a very long campaign. Grant had multiple efforts to try to take the city of Vicksburg before it fell. Another interesting fact is the model that they used for the soldier up there was made after the war, so they did not have a historically correct weapon for the period. It's actually an 1873 model Springfield trapdoor rifle is the model the sculptor used. So it's visually similar, but if you know what you're looking for, it's not correct for the actual period of what a Wisconsin soldier would carry during the siege.
Well, thank you for that. Now, the model for the cavalry, can we assume that's the 2nd Wisconsin there?
If I recall correctly, that's the only Wisconsin cavalry regiment that participates. So it should be actually 4th Wisconsin. What pattern sword is this?
So this here is a 1840 pattern non-commissioned officer's sword. This particular one was made in 1864 by Ames Manufacturing Company out of Chicopee, Massachusetts. It's very common. So basically, this is what the non-commissioned officers would use. And you can see here the distal taper. So notice one of the things that you want to look at in the replicas, why they don't feel, because the distal taper is pretty much flat. There's no, so it starts out, notice how it starts out really thick here at about 8 millimeters and then tapers off. So that actually helps with the weight and balance.
Oh yeah, I can feel the balance. Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah.
Oh. I like that stop. Like it's like we're so far balanced.
Now, if you notice, this does not really have an edge on it. However, if you get enough tip speed, so start from an outside guard, and it's just nice, yeah. So the swords don't have to be razor sharp. In fact, you don't want them razor sharp because they get dull pretty quickly. But with a proper cutting technique, it's all in the wrist, and the fingers mostly. You accelerate that tip of the fingers.
Okay, that is very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for showing me this.
Awesome.
Do you know, like what soldier and what regiment that sword's associated with? There?
No, not this particular one. Like I said, pretty much all non-commissioned officers. This is what sergeants. This is what they would carry.
If they did bother even carrying a sword.
If they did bother, yeah. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time.
No problem.
Coming out here and helping me find the 2nd Wisconsin Monument here. I probably would have been, since it's facing the other way, I would have been around here all day. Probably would have never found it. So I appreciate very, very much taking the time.
Well, and I appreciate you telling me a little bit about this sword and American military swordsmanship in particular.
Oh yes, absolutely. And like I said, it's just awesome that you happen to be in the HEMA. As well, and so yes, we're actually trying to grow an American, and it is HEMA because all of the roots of even Colonel Thomas's Stevens system. Like I said, he was born in Britain. He joined the British military, became a member of Queen Victoria's bodyguard, was trained in the Angelo system of swordsmanship. So at the time in Britain, Henry Angelo Jr. wrote the first codified manual for the entire British Army. And then when that was adopted in 1817, all the regiments were required to bring officers and non-commissioned officers from each regiment to be trained by Henry Angelo in this new system of swordsmanship. So basically the training is kind of like a trainer course, that you send, of course, being in the Air Force Reserve, you're kind of familiar with how the military trains. Yes, hasn't trained. So they send so it's a trainer course. All the regiments sent their instructors, non-commissioned officers to learn the system, and they went back to the regiments with a copy of the manuals. So the manuals were like instructor guides. So you can't really get the whole system. It's kind of a no. So that's one of the challenges, like as with all HEMA, you know, going all the way back to 133 manuscript and you know, Joachim Meyer's long sword treatises and some of the other sort is they're basically guides, and so you have to kind of rework it. Now, of course, it's written in English, so we don't have to like translate old Latin or German or anything. But still, it's still a guide. You still kind of have to work through it, come up with an interpretation that works, that makes sense. And so, so basically, the trainer course is basically it's a 6-week course, training 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You know,
Ooh.
so it kind of gives you an idea how many hours they
That's
train.
a lot of hours.
Yeah, so 6 days a week, 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, over a course of 6 weeks was the original British course. And then they went back to their regiments. They trained up their regiments. Now it's possible that now obviously Colonel Stevens at this time was trained in this system of swordsmanship. Then when he immigrated to the United States, he basically started teaching his style of swordsmanship, you know, first to the Pennsylvania militia, where he published his 1843, and then his 1844 edition for the Pennsylvania militia. He later moves to Wisconsin, where he becomes the Inspector General of the Wisconsin State Militia. Alexander Randall basically hears of him and brings him into his office one day, because Alexander Randall basically starts abolitionists, was basically putting together regiments to feed, you know, to the Union forces for the Civil War. So he's raising all these regiments, put together a training camp in Camp Randall. So he hears of Thomas Stevens, brings him in his office, and he says, you know, I hear you know something about handling a sword. And basically, you know, offers him a job. He says, you know, you want a job? And he's like, well, it's something I can do. I want you to train, you know, officers, you know, lieutenants, captains, majors, colonels, how to use their sword. Can you do that? And he's like, I think so. No, that won't do. Can you do it? He's like, yes, sir. Okay. And he tells him to go down to Camp Randall and arrange for, you know, and put together a swordsmanship instruction. And so when he got down there, he was paid $5 a day, you know, back then to train, and he was basically a sword instructor for all the regiments coming through. So obviously, you know, and one of the more famous, you know, regiments like the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, which we know from the Iron Brigade, which participated in you know, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So a lot of noteworthy officers was trained by Colonel Thomas Stevens.
Well, and that training is particularly important given how quickly they're trying to mobilize troops. I mean, there's lots of people there who probably never even seen a sword in person.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So it was a major thing. Not obviously not all the units in the United States military at the time had, you know, a dedicated sword master like this. So that's why, which makes the Wisconsin units very, very kind of unique, kind of in a way. Obviously, you know, you had the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which Henry Wayne was the sword director of the exercise. He later participated in the Civil War as well on the Confederate side, because he's from Savannah. But he actually, when he was the director of the sword exercise at West Point, he met with Colonel Stevens, and basically called him the best master of his weapon that he's met with, which is pretty high praise from, you know, the director of the sword exercise at West Point. But yeah, so like I said, I'm putting all this together, and hopefully, you know, have my book published at some point.
I'm excited to read it.
Yes. Well, I appreciate it one more time. You've taken the time to show me around,
Anytime,
and we'll see
Maybe in a class.
in a class. Yes.